Charles II of Spain couldn't chew his own food. His jaw was so malformed, the famous Hapsburg jaw, generations of cousin marriages made flesh, that his teeth didn't meet. He couldn't close his mouth properly. He drooled constantly. When he died in 1700 at 38 years old, childless and decrepit, his autopsy revealed a body that had essentially destroyed itself from within. A heart the size of a peppercorn, a single blackened testicle. Intestines so rotten, the physicians described them as gangrenous. His skull was filled with water, not metaphorically, literally filled with fluid where brain matter should have been. Charles was the end product of generations of strategic marriage. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were first cousins. If you trace his family tree back, it doesn't branch. It loops. The same ancestors appear in multiple positions. Charles had fewer distinct great-great-great-grandparents than a person with unrelated parents would have great-grandparents. You know this story. It's the "family tree is a circle" meme. Hapsburg inbreeding. Historical curiosity. Something that happened centuries ago to foolish aristocrats who didn't understand genetics. Here's what you probably don't know. The legal framework that created Charles II, first cousin marriage, is completely legal in England right now. It's legal in Australia, and it's legal in the majority of the United States. Not legal in some dusty historical loophole sense. Legal as in you could file the paperwork tomorrow morning. Charles died in 1700. The law that permitted his existence hasn't changed. To understand how a practice that produced Charles II remains on the books 3 centuries later, we need to trace what happened after the Hapsburg extinction, because far from serving as a warning, the Spanish royal catastrophe barely registered as a cautionary tale among the European elite. The same marriage practices continued, the same logic persisted, and some of the most romanticized figures in Western history were products of exactly the same system that destroyed Charles. Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in February 1840 at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. The great love story. The romance that defined an era. Victoria was so devastated when Albert died in 1861 that she wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. They popularized the Christmas tree tradition. Their marriage became the template for Victorian ideals of companionate love between equals. They were first cousins, not distant cousins, not technically related if you squint at the genealogy, first cousins through direct sibling connection. Victoria's mother, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, and Albert's father, Duke Ernest I of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, were brother and sister. Full siblings, children of the same parents, Duke Francis and Duchess Augusta of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Which means, when Victoria and Albert stood at the altar, they shared both grandparents on that entire side of the family. Francis and Augusta were grandmother and grandfather to both the bride and the groom. This raised no eyebrows. None. Among European aristocracy in 1840, cousin marriage was so common as to be unremarkable, the same unremarkable it had been when Charles II's parents wed, the same unremarkable it would remain for decades to come. The strategic logic that had driven the Habsburgs drove the Saxe-Coburgs. Marrying Albert kept influence consolidated, inheritance flowing in predictable channels, no messy outsiders complicating the web of royal alliances. Charles II had been dead for 140 years. His catastrophic genetics had ended his entire family line, and the practice that created him was still considered perfectly sensible dynastic planning. But biology doesn't care about strategic logic. Victoria carried a mutation on her X chromosome, Hemophilia B, also called factor IX deficiency, a blood clotting disorder. As a carrier, Victoria herself was unaffected. Women have 2 X chromosomes, so a functional copy on one can compensate for a defective copy on the other. But Victoria could pass that defective gene to her children. Daughters who inherited it would become carriers like their mother. Sons who inherited it would have the disease. Hemophilia means your blood doesn't clot properly. Minor cuts become dangerous. Internal bleeding from small injuries can be fatal. A hemophiliac child is a child in constant peril. Victoria and Albert had 9 children who survived to adulthood. The mutation spread. Here's where this stops being abstract genealogy and starts being European history. Victoria's daughter Alice passed the gene to her daughter Alexandra. Alexandra became Empress of Russia through her marriage to Tsar Nicholas II. And Alexandra passed hemophilia to her only son, Alexei, the heir to the Russian throne. Alexei couldn't stop bleeding from minor injuries. His mother, the Empress, was desperate enough to turn to anyone who claimed they could help. Enter Grigory Rasputin, the mystic, the scandal, the man whose influence over the Russian royal family became so destabilizing that historians cite it as one factor in the revolutionary ferment that destroyed the Romanov dynasty entirely. Rasputin's power came from one thing. The Empress believed he could ease Alexei's suffering, and Alexei's suffering existed because of a genetic mutation that had spread through royal families who kept marrying their relatives. The hemophilia appeared in Spain, too. Victoria's youngest daughter, Beatrice, married into the Spanish royal family through her daughter, Victoria Eugenie, who wed King Alfonso XIII. 2 of Victoria Eugenie's sons were hemophiliacs. The genetic legacy continued affecting the Spanish royal line, the same royal line that had suffered Charles II into the 20th century. Charles II was extinct. His specific genetic catastrophe had ended, but the practices that created him had seeded new genetic catastrophes across the continent. Now, precision matters here. The hemophilia mutation itself wasn't caused by the cousin marriage between Victoria and Albert. It likely arose spontaneously in Victoria or came from an earlier generation we can't trace. But the marriage practices created the transmission network. The same intermarriage patterns that concentrated power also concentrated genetic risk. Once hemophilia entered the royal bloodlines, it spread to virtually every throne in Europe, because those thrones kept marrying each other. Charles II had no children. The Romanovs were executed by revolutionaries in 1918. The Spanish hemophiliac princes lived difficult, shortened lives. The pattern repeated: strategic intermarriage, genetic consequences, suffering. And throughout all of this, no one changed the laws. Victoria and Albert weren't alone among their educated, progressive contemporaries who married first cousins. The year before their wedding, in January 1839, Charles Darwin married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, at St. Peter's Church in Maer, Staffordshire. Darwin, the man who would describe natural selection, who understood variation and heredity better than anyone alive. He married his first cousin. The Darwins and Wedgwoods were already interconnected through multiple previous marriages. Charles's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had a second wife from the Wedgwood family. The match between Charles and Emma was considered excellent by everyone involved: socially appropriate, economically sensible, emotionally compatible. Darwin and Emma had 10 children. 7 survived to adulthood. 3 died in childhood. And Darwin, who spent his professional life studying inherited variation, became increasingly terrified that he'd done something terrible to his own family. His children had chronic health problems, illnesses that wouldn't resolve, weakness. His favorite daughter, Annie, died at 10 years old, and Darwin's grief was complicated by a fear he couldn't quite articulate to anyone. Had he caused this? He conducted extensive studies of inbreeding in plants and animals. The results were unambiguous. Inbreeding depression was real. Offspring of closely related parents showed reduced vigor, increased susceptibility to disease, lower fertility. The mechanism wouldn't be understood until genetics emerged as a science decades later, but the pattern was clear in Darwin's data. He lobbied for the British census to collect data on cousin marriage so the effects could be studied scientifically in human populations. He wanted evidence. He needed to know whether his fears about his own family were justified or paranoid. The census question he pushed for was never implemented. Parliament wasn't interested. The topic was socially awkward. Too many powerful families had cousin marriages in their recent history to want official data collection. Darwin never publicly advocated for legal prohibition. His private letters reveal his anxieties, but he never took a public stance against the practice he'd participated in and couldn't undo. His marriage to his first cousin remained entirely legal and socially unremarkable until the day he died in 1882. Charles II had been extinct for 182 years. Darwin had documented inbreeding depression. Victoria's hemophilia was spreading through royal houses, and the laws permitting first cousin marriage remained exactly where they had always been. The question that haunts this entire history is why? Why didn't anyone change the laws? Why doesn't anyone change them now? The answer requires understanding that two completely different legal histories unfolded on opposite sides of the Atlantic, and neither one was driven by careful consideration of genetics. Let's start with the United States. Between 1900 and 1930, American states began passing prohibitions against first cousin marriage. Kansas was among the early adopters. Others across the Midwest and South followed in subsequent decades. But here's the uncomfortable truth about why. The motivations were explicitly eugenic. Not eugenic in the modern sense of considering genetic health. Eugenic in the early 20th century sense. The pseudo-scientific movement that promoted forced sterilization of people deemed feeble-minded, that pushed for immigration restrictions against inferior ethnic groups, that ranked human beings by supposed genetic worth. The legislators who voted for cousin marriage bans often supported compulsory sterilization laws in the same legislative sessions. The rhetoric around cousin marriage prohibition was tangled up with racism, nativism, and social control of undesirable populations. It wasn't about protecting children from genetic disorders. It was about preventing degeneracy and maintaining race purity. This origin matters enormously for understanding the present. States that enacted prohibitions during the eugenics era have generally kept them on the books, not because anyone revisited the question, but because laws tend to persist unless someone actively removes them. States that never prohibited the practice have felt no urgency to adopt prohibitions, partly because the issue carries that uncomfortable eugenic association. The result is a patchwork that reflects early 20th century politics, not modern genetic science. There is no federal law governing cousin marriage. Marriage law belongs entirely to individual states, and those states have made wildly inconsistent choices based on accidents of history, rather than any coherent policy. First cousins can marry with no restrictions whatsoever in California. Same in Colorado, same in New York, Alabama, Alaska, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Tennessee, Vermont, Virginia. All permit first cousin marriage without conditions. Arizona allows it only if one spouse cannot reproduce, a fertility restriction that essentially permits postmenopausal couples but bars younger ones. Indiana has the same restriction. Utah requires both parties to be over 55, which accomplishes something similar through an age requirement rather than a fertility test. Maine requires genetic counseling before first cousins can marry. The state won't stop you, but it wants you to understand the risks first. Illinois and Wisconsin have similar counseling or age requirements. Texas prohibits first cousin marriage entirely. So do Arkansas, Delaware, Idaho, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania, South Dakota, Washington, West Virginia, and Wyoming. Some of those prohibition states treat violations as void marriages. The marriage simply doesn't exist in the eyes of the law. Others treat cousin marriage as a criminal offense. 27 states allow first cousin marriage to some degree. The remaining states prohibit it. There is a meaningful chance your state allows it, and you never had any idea. Now cross the Atlantic. The United Kingdom never enacted prohibitions against cousin marriage. Not during the Victorian era, when the practice was common among elites. Not during the early 20th century, when America was passing eugenic restrictions. Not after World War II. Not ever. When Parliament passed the Marriage Act, 1949, the statute that consolidated and updated English marriage law, first cousins were conspicuously absent from the list of prohibited relationships. You cannot marry your parent, grandparent, child, grandchild, sibling, aunt, uncle, niece, or nephew. Those relationships are forbidden. But your cousin? Perfectly fine. File the paperwork. The state has no objection. This wasn't an oversight or a drafting error. The Church of England, which has shaped English marriage law far more than any secular legislature, never prohibited cousin marriage. The Book of Common Prayer's Table of Kindred and Affinity, the document that governed Anglican marriage for centuries, didn't include first cousins among forbidden relationships. And here's the irony that borders on absurdity. Henry VIII, the monarch who executed 2 wives and annulled 2 more, who dissolved the monasteries, who broke from Rome because the Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce. His personal marital chaos, driven entirely by his desperation for a male heir, inadvertently established a church that would preserve a legal framework permitting first cousin marriage. The Church of England exists because Henry VIII wanted to remarry. And that church's marriage rules, carried forward through centuries, are why first cousin marriage remains legal in England today. Charles II died in 1700. Henry VIII broke from Rome in the 1530s. The legal framework that permits cousin marriage in England predates the Hapsburg extinction. Australia followed the English pattern. As a former colony that inherited English common law, Australia had never prohibited cousin marriage at the state level. When the Federal Marriage Act passed in 1961, it made no move to change this tradition. The entire Commonwealth of Australia recognizes first cousin marriage as fully legal and valid. No state-by-state variations, no conditional permissions based on age or fertility, no genetic counseling requirements. That's still the law in 2024. So we've established where cousin marriage is legal. But the harder question lurks underneath. Who is actually doing this? The answer isn't historical curiosity. It's current practice. And the motivations would be familiar to the Hapsburgs, the ruling families of the United Arab Emirates, the Al Nahyan of Abu Dhabi, the Al Maktoum of Dubai, the ruling families of the other 5 emirates, have maintained marriage practices that Charles II's ancestors would recognize immediately. Consanguinity rates in the UAE are among the highest in the world. Studies conducted over the past several decades have consistently found that between 40 and 50% of all marriages in the UAE are consanguineous, meaning between relatives of varying degrees, first cousins, second cousins, more distant relations. Among the ruling families specifically, the rates are believed to be even higher, though precise figures are difficult to obtain. Royal family matters are private. But the pattern is visible in genealogies, the same family names appearing in both the bride's and groom's lineages, generation after generation. The motivations are economic and political, same as they were for the Hapsburgs, same as they were for Victoria and Albert. Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund manages assets exceeding $1 trillion. Not million, not billion, trillion. The logic of keeping that wealth within the family through strategic intermarriage is the same logic that drove European aristocrats 500 years ago. When your family controls generational wealth at that scale, every marriage to an outsider represents potential dilution. The spouse's family gains access to your network. Divorce becomes catastrophically expensive. Children inherit partly from your wealth and partly from the outside family's claims. Each generation of outmarriage spreads consolidated wealth among an ever-expanding network of in-laws and their relatives. Cousin marriage breaks this pattern. When first cousins marry, both sides are already part of the family's wealth structure. The shared grandparents mean any inheritance flows from family members to family members, rather than dispersing outward. The fortune stays concentrated. Saudi Arabia shows similar patterns. Studies have found consanguinity rates ranging from 50 to 60% in the Saudi population overall, not just among royalty, but throughout the society. The Saudi royal family, the House of Saud, has practiced extensive intermarriage throughout its history. The genetic consequences of these practices are medically documented and statistically significant. Studies of Gulf populations have found elevated rates of autosomal recessive disorders, conditions that manifest when a child inherits the same defective gene from both parents. If your parents are unrelated, the odds of them both carrying the same rare mutation are low. If your parents are first cousins, those odds increase dramatically because first cousins share 1/8 of their genetic material. Thalassemia, sickle cell disease, various metabolic disorders, conditions that require 2 copies of a defective gene to manifest, all statistically more common in populations with high consanguinity rates. In 2004, Saudi Arabia implemented a response that acknowledged the genetic science while preserving the legal and cultural permission for cousin marriage. Mandatory premarital genetic screening. Couples planning to marry must undergo testing to identify whether both partners carry the same recessive mutations that could cause genetic disorders in their children. The program provides counseling, risk assessment, clear information about what might happen. But it doesn't prohibit marriages that test as high risk. The decision stays with the couple and their families. The state's position is, we'll give you the information, but we won't stop you. Acknowledge the science, provide data, preserve the practice. Britain has taken a similar approach in recent years, driven by health concerns about specific communities where cousin marriage remains common. The Born in Bradford study, launched in 2007, became one of the largest and most comprehensive investigations of child health in Britain. Researchers tracked births in Bradford, a city in West Yorkshire with a large British Pakistani population, communities where cultural traditions from regions of Pakistan with high consanguinity rates had been transplanted to England. The findings were stark. Children born to first cousin parents face approximately double the risk of congenital abnormalities compared to children of unrelated parents. Not a marginal increase, double. In some Pakistani British communities in Bradford, researchers found that more than 50% of marriages were between first cousins. These weren't isolated cases or outliers, they were community norms. The same norms that had existed in the family's regions of origin carried across continents. The Born in Bradford data was published in academic journals and reported in British media. It made the genetic risks of cousin marriage impossible to ignore in public health terms. It sparked periodic calls for legal reform. Those calls have gone nowhere. Recent polling shows that over 3/4 of Britons believe first cousin marriage should not be legal. Only about 1 in 10 support keeping the current permissive law. The overwhelming majority want it banned. Parliament won't touch the issue. Politicians who raise the topic face accusations of targeting specific ethnic and religious communities. The combination of cultural sensitivity, fears of appearing bigoted, and general political risk has kept cousin marriage firmly in the category of issues nobody wants to champion. The current approach in England relies on genetic counseling and public health outreach rather than legal prohibition. Medical professionals in communities with high consanguinity rates are trained to discuss the risks. Educational materials exist. Nobody is stopping you from marrying your cousin, but someone might gently suggest you consider genetic testing first. Critics call this insufficient. Defenders argue it respects personal autonomy and cultural diversity. Either way, the law stays exactly where it was when the Marriage Act passed in 1949. So here's where we arrive after tracing 3 centuries of history. Charles II of Spain died in 1700. His autopsy revealed a body that had destroyed itself from within. The culmination of generations of Hapsburg cousin marriages designed to preserve power and consolidate wealth. His jaw so malformed, he couldn't chew. His body so damaged, he couldn't produce an heir. His death triggered a continental war. His family line went extinct. His story became a meme about family trees shaped like circles. And then nothing changed. 140 years after Charles died, Victoria and Albert were first cousins at their wedding. Their marriage spread hemophilia through the royal houses of Europe. 139 years after Charles, Darwin married his first cousin and spent his remaining decades quietly terrified of what he'd done to his children, documenting inbreeding depression in every species except his own. The Rothschilds married 16 of 18 great-great-grandchildren to first or second cousins as deliberate economic strategy. The 20th century saw some American states ban the practice, but for eugenic reasons tangled up with racism and pseudoscience, not for the sake of protecting children. The states that never banned it kept on not banning it. Britain never considered prohibition. Australia codified permission. Today, the UAE's ruling families practice the same strategic intermarriage the Habsburgs did, motivated by the same wealth preservation logic, backed by sovereign wealth funds worth more than the entire GDP of most nations. Britain has most of its population wanting cousin marriage banned, and a political class that won't discuss the issue. America has a patchwork of laws that reflects which states were influenced by eugenicists a century ago. The Hapsburgs weren't an anomaly we learned from. They were the most famous example of something that never stopped. Charles II's family tree was a circle, so legally speaking, could yours be? Depending on where you live. The laws that permitted Charles II to exist permit the same genetic consolidation today. In your country, possibly in your state, defended by the same wealth preservation logic that drove aristocrats 5 centuries ago and drives Gulf royalty today. Charles couldn't chew his own food. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. He was the end product of generations of strategic marriage, and his suffering was supposed to be the cautionary tale. 300 years later, the paperwork for first cousin marriage is available at courthouses across the Western world. The question everyone asks is, how is this still allowed? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, seems to be this: because changing it is politically inconvenient. Because the people with the most wealth have the most incentive to preserve the practice. Because cultural sensitivities make the topic radioactive. And because nobody with power has decided Charles II's suffering was lesson enough. The Habsburgs bred themselves into extinction 3 centuries ago. The legal frameworks that allowed them to do it are still on the books. Subscribe for more stories like this.